18 years ago, Darius Whitfield, a broke single black father, was walking home from work when he saw a homeless girl shivering under a bus station awning. He hesitated only a moment before making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Now he stands accused of embezzling from the $900 million empire he built from nothing. The daughter he raised has vanished, days before the emergency hearing that could end everything. And as the chancellor lifts her pen to sign the order that would strip him of his company forever, the courtroom doors swing open. Stick around for this one and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Darius Whitfield was 53 years old on the morning his world started coming apart. He stood in the glass-walled boardroom of the company he had built from nothing, still wearing the same style of worn canvas jacket he'd worn as a young man on the docks. Whitfield Harbor Rail was worth nearly $900 million now, a privately held transportation empire of cold storage warehouses and private rail lines stretching across several states. And Darius owned the majority of it outright, 62% of the common shares, a number that would matter more than anyone in that room yet realized. 6 years earlier, to fund an expansion, the company had accepted a significant investment from a private equity firm called Ashcroft Equity, run by a sharp, image-conscious woman named Vivian Ashcroft, who now held 18% in preferred shares along with a seat on the board. Darius could feel something shifting in the room that morning, a coolness in the way certain board members avoided his eyes, a stiffness in the small talk before the meeting began. Preston Kingsley, the board's chairman, greeted him with his usual polished warmth, the same warmth he used with reporters whenever he told the story of Darius rising from poverty to build an empire. Behind that warmth, though, something felt different, and Darius couldn't yet name what it was, only that an instinct built over decades of reading rooms full of men who underestimated him was telling him to pay attention. Gerald Thornberry, another longtime board member, spoke up first. He chose his words with the careful politeness of a man who believed he was being reasonable rather than unfair. He suggested, gently, that the company's governance structure had perhaps not kept pace with its growth, that decisions were still being made too much on instinct and not enough on modern financial discipline. He never mentioned race directly, but the shape of what he meant sat underneath the words clearly enough that Darius understood exactly who he was describing. Darius let it pass, the way he'd let 1,000 comments like it pass over the years, refusing to let bitterness curdle into something that would poison the way he treated people. He thought, without warning, of a rainy night more than 18 years earlier. Walking home soaked to the bone from a double shift at this very harbor, he had almost passed a bus station without noticing the small shape huddled beneath the awning. A girl, no older than 10, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. When help finally arrived, she'd asked him only one question: whether he would come back. He came back every week for months until the adoption was finalized, and then he knelt in a courthouse hallway and pressed a small brass key into her palm and told her that in their family, nobody would ever have to stand alone in the rain again. That girl was Amara, 28 now, a senior associate at a law firm in Washington, D.C., 5 years into a career built on exactly the kind of promise her father had once made her. She read every contract to the very last word, just as he'd taught her at their kitchen table back when he sold the company's first truck to help cover her tuition. Elias had been only 8 the week Amara moved in, afraid at first that a new sister would take away what little of his father's attention remained. That fear dissolved fast once he noticed the way she flinched at slamming doors and hid crackers under her pillow, some deep part of her still expecting the world to take food away without warning. He stopped seeing her as competition and started seeing her as something worth protecting, a shift that shaped the two of them into something closer than most siblings ever manage. Years earlier, back when the company was still 3 second-hand trucks and a leaking warehouse, Darius had sat down with a soft-spoken attorney named Walter Bennett to set the business up properly. Near the end of that meeting, Walter said something Darius didn't fully understand at the time, that he was building something people would eventually want to take from him, and that he'd need a door out that only he knew existed if anyone ever tried to use his own family against him. On Walter's advice, Darius quietly placed a portion of his personal founding shares into a private trust bearing Amara's name, a decision he barely thought about again in the years since. His son Elias, now the company's director of technical operations, sat 2 seats down that morning. For months he'd been noticing small irregularities in the maintenance budgets that never quite added up. Every time he raised them with the board, Kingsley offered a calm, reasonable explanation that closed the conversation before Elias could push further. Elias filed each explanation away without fully believing it, unsure whether he was watching carelessness or something more deliberate, a doubt that had been quietly building for months with nowhere to go. What none of them yet knew was that Kingsley was carrying a private financial burden that had pushed him toward decisions he never would have considered a few years earlier. He had begun accept secret payments, disguised as consulting fees, from a shell company connected to Ashcroft Equity, payments meant to grease the wheels of a hostile takeover that would strip Darius of control and hand a majority stake fee to Vivian Ashcroft at a fraction of what the company was worth. He needed only one thing to make it happen: a reason serious enough to convince a court to freeze Darius's voting rights, and he had already decided exactly where he would find it. The accusation landed less than a week later, with the precision of something planned rather than discovered. Kingsley presented the board with documents alleging that Darius had secretly diverted company cash and assets, not his own personal shares, but actual corporate funds, into a hidden trust bearing Amara's name. The bank statements looked authentic at first glance, complete with transfer dates and signatures that matched Darius's own handwriting closely enough to convince anyone who wasn't looking too carefully. Word reached the press within days, and the story that emerged wasn't really about accounting at all. It was about a poor black mechanic who had climbed his way into wealth, and once he had power, had quietly funneled company money to the daughter he adopted off the street. Reporters who had once celebrated his rise from poverty now used that very same story as evidence of hidden motive, twisting the most tender chapter of his life into something that sounded calculated and self-serving. Darius read the first headline standing at his kitchen counter before sunrise, coffee going cold beside him, and felt something close to grief settle into his chest, not for his reputation, for the way a story about love had been rewritten into a story about greed. He thought about the men and women who loaded his trucks every morning, people who had never once asked him to prove himself beyond showing up and doing right by them, and he wondered how many of them would read those headlines before they ever heard his side. Kingsley's real target was never Amara or the trust. His goal was to convince a court to freeze Darius's voting rights just long enough for the board to force through a sale of a controlling stake to Ashcroft Equity, at a price far below what the company was worth. Once that vote passed, Darius would become a minority shareholder in the very empire he'd built with his own hands, powerless to stop whatever came next. The board scheduled an emergency hearing just over a week out. Every day that passed without a defense made the outcome look more certain. When Elias finally reached his sister by phone to warn her, something felt wrong from the first ring. Amara's voice was tight and rushed, and before he could finish explaining, she cut him off with a message that made no sense on its own. She told him not to look for her, not to tell their father anything. And if anyone asked, he should simply say she'd walked away from the family. Trust me, just this once. Don't ask me why. Elias sat in his car outside the office for nearly 20 minutes after that call ended, turning her words over. His sister had never spoken to him like that before, clipped and certain, as if she were following a plan she couldn't explain out loud. And somewhere beneath his confusion he understood. This wasn't abandonment. It felt more like a door quietly closing so something important could happen on the other side of it. Something she needed him to protect simply by staying silent. Kingsley wasted no time exploiting her disappearance, feeding reporters the suggestion that Amara had either abandoned her adoptive father in his moment of need or been quietly paid off by Ashcroft Equity to vanish before she could testify. Elias wanted to fight back publicly, to call every reporter himself and demand they find his sister, but Darius stopped him with a steadiness that surprised even his own attorney. "I never adopted her, so she'd owe me a debt to repay," Darius said quietly. "Wherever she is, whatever she's doing, she's still my daughter. I won't let anyone turn that into a weapon. Not against her and not against me. It was in this narrow window, his company's reputation collapsing, his daughter gone silent, that Kingsley made Darius an offer disguised as mercy. Speaking for the board, he proposed that Darius resign, quietly accept a substantial severance, and retain a modest 20% minority stake in exchange for signing a permanent confidentiality agreement that would bury any mention of the trust or Amara's role in it forever. On paper, it was the safest way out for a man his age with a family to protect, walk away wealthy and untouched by scandal. Darius refused. Instead, he made a choice that carried a far heavier personal cost. He used a significant portion of his own personal shares, the ones held entirely outside the protected trust, as collateral for an emergency loan large enough to keep payroll running and operations moving in case the company's accounts were frozen before the hearing concluded. If he lost this fight, he wouldn't simply lose the company. He'd lose the pledged shares, too. A personal financial collapse layered directly on top of a professional one. Standing in his office that evening, staring out at the rows of trucks lined along the dock he used to work as a young man, Darius understood exactly what he was risking. He had spent 18 years building something meant to protect people who'd never had anyone protect them. And now that same purpose was asking him to risk everything he personally owned to buy his company a few more days. He thought of the key he'd once placed in a frightened child's palm, and of the promise that nobody in his family would ever stand alone in the rain again. Whatever came next, he intended to keep that promise, even if it cost him everything he'd built to make it possible. The days that followed felt different from any hardship he'd faced before. Poverty, he'd always told himself, was something he'd survived once and could survive again. What kept him awake now was not the fear of losing money, but the fear of watching something built on trust get twisted into a weapon against the very people who trusted him most. The accusations spread through the business community faster than he could have imagined, and the effects showed up almost immediately. Two long-standing shipping partners quietly paused their contracts pending the outcome of the board's review, citing risk exposure in language that sounded polite but landed like a slap. A regional bank that had financed the rail expansion 2 years earlier sent a letter requesting additional documentation before releasing the next scheduled disbursement, a request that had never once come up in years of steady payments. Gerald Thornberry, still unaware of the true nature of Kingsley's motives, used the board's next call to suggest, gently but firmly, that Darius consider stepping aside temporarily while the allegations were resolved. He framed it as protecting the company's image, not as an accusation of guilt, careful with his words, the way people are careful when they believe they're being reasonable. Darius listened to the entire call without raising his voice, though his hand gripped the edge of his desk hard enough to leave a mark. Vivian Ashcroft gave a brief interview to a regional business paper that week, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how far she could go. She said a company approaching $1 billion in value could not be run on sentiment or on what she called rescue narratives. The phrase made its way around the office within hours and stung more than any direct insult could have. Darius understood immediately who she was really talking about. He'd hired Sandra Coleman, a seasoned corporate attorney out of Wilmington with a reputation for handling complicated governance disputes, the moment the accusations became public. Sandra was sharp and thorough, and she understood Delaware corporate law better than almost anyone in the state. But she had one gap in her defense that worried her more each day. The original trust documents, drafted by Walter Bennett years earlier, had never resurfaced since his retirement. Without them, Sandra was building a defense around the one document that could settle everything, and she didn't have it. Inside the company, Elias carried a weight nobody else could see. He held his sister's strange, urgent instructions close, replaying them over and over, trying to decide whether silence was loyalty or a mistake he'd regret for the rest of his life. And he kept circling back to the maintenance irregularities that had never been fully explained. Late one evening, alone in his office long after the operations floor had emptied, he pulled archived maintenance records going back nearly 2 years. He found gaps where entire email threads should have existed, conversations about budget cuts that had clearly happened but left almost no digital trace. It wasn't enough to bring to the board on its own, but it was enough to convince him that Kingsley's fingerprints were on more than just the accusations against his father. He kept it to himself for 2 more days, unsure who he could trust inside a company suddenly full of people choosing sides. Every conversation in the break room seemed to carry a second meaning, colleagues who'd known him for years suddenly careful about what they said in front of him, as though loyalty itself had become something people needed to calculate rather than simply feel. He began saving copies of everything onto a personal drive at home. Unsure yet what he'd do with it, only certain he couldn't let it disappear the way the emails already had. 300 miles away in Washington, Amara was living a different kind of storm. After Elias's call, she'd spent a sleepless night searching her memory for anything Walter Bennett might have mentioned years earlier, when she was still a law student helping organize old family paperwork over a holiday break. She remembered faintly a dinner nearly 10 years back when Walter had mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd helped her father set up, something meant to protect the company if it ever grew large enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. She'd been a college student then, more interested in her exams, and she'd never asked what that protection looked like. Now that vague memory was the only thread she had to pull. She tracked down Walter's old law office and found it had closed when he retired, its files transferred to a records management company for long-term digital storage. When she finally reached someone in the archive department, she learned that the company had a standard retention window, and the Whitfield file, untouched for years, was already inside the automated purge queue. Once a file entered that queue, an administrator's authorization was the only thing that could pull it back out. Desperate, she reached Walter's daughter, a woman she'd met only briefly at family gatherings, now overseeing part of her father's old client relationships. Amara explained the situation as clearly and urgently as she could without revealing everything at stake, and Walter's daughter, who remembered her own father speaking warmly of Darius, agreed to authorize emergency access to the backup before the file was gone. Amara spent the better part of 2 days combing through disorganized scans for anything in her father's handwriting. She found it almost by accident, buried in a folder mislabeled with an old project code, the original Whitfield Founders Trust document, scanned, along with a handwritten letter from her father, dated the same year the trust was created, addressed simply to her by name, explaining that the shares placed inside the trust were his own personal shares, set aside long before the company ever went looking for outside investment. It was never company money. It had never been company money at all. While she absorbed what she'd found, a second and far more personal crisis was unfolding. Her firm, it turned out, held a long-standing advisory relationship with Ashcroft Equity, one of its more lucrative institutional clients, and firm leadership made clear within days that her involvement in her father's case created an unacceptable conflict of interest. She was told, in a private meeting with 2 senior partners, that if she continued pursuing anything related to the matter, her upcoming partnership consideration would be over before it began. Amara chose to continue anyway, working quietly outside business hours, careful never to use firm resources or firm time. It didn't matter. Within days, leadership discovered what she was doing and terminated her employment, citing a breach of the very conflict policy they'd warned her about. She lost her position, her standing in a competitive legal market, and the partnership track she'd spent 5 years building, all before she had even set foot in the courtroom that would decide her father's fate. The termination meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, conducted by 2 partners who had once praised her work in front of the entire firm and now spoke to her in the flattened, careful tone people use when they've already decided something and simply need to deliver it. She walked out carrying a single box of belongings, past desks where colleagues suddenly found reasons not to look up, and sat in her car in the parking garage a long while before she trusted herself to drive. She allowed herself exactly 1 night to grieve. Alone in her apartment, the trust document spread across her kitchen table, the same kind of table where her father had once told her never to sign anything without reading it to the very last word. She thought about calling him just to hear his voice and decided against it, knowing that hearing what she'd already given up would only make him try harder to stop her from giving up anything more. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would not attempt to represent her father in court, both because she no longer had a firm behind her and because, as the named beneficiary connected to the trust, she understood too well that serving as his attorney would create exactly the kind of conflict Kingsley's team could use to discredit everything she brought forward. Instead, she reached out directly to Sandra Coleman, introduced herself, and explained calmly and precisely what she'd found. She offered to appear not as counsel, but as a witness, the person named in the original documents as the trust's designated protector, someone who could speak to its true purpose from first-hand knowledge. Sandra listened and understood immediately that this changed the entire shape of their defense. But there was still a missing piece, one that worried both women equally. The trust explained why Darius had done nothing wrong. It did nothing to explain why Kingsley had manufactured false evidence in the first place, or who else was involved. Amara believed there had to be a financial trail somewhere connecting Kingsley to Ashcroft Equity, some reason a respected board chairman would risk everything to frame the man who'd built the company he served. The answer surfaced through an unexpected source. Renee Castillo, Kingsley's longtime executive assistant, had spent months growing uneasy about certain messages she'd been asked to forward and certain files she'd been asked to quietly archive outside normal company channels. When Amara reached out through a mutual contact from her earlier career, Renee agreed to meet. A quiet coffee shop far from the offices, clearly nervous, but resolved to finally say something. She arrived early and sat facing the door, hands wrapped around cups she never touched, glancing toward the window every few minutes as though she expected someone from the office to walk past. She told Amara she'd thought about coming forward for weeks, ever since she first noticed the timing between certain messages and certain decisions that never quite made sense on their own. What finally pushed her, she said, was watching the news twist a father's love into a headline about greed, knowing she was one of the few people who could prove it wasn't true. Renee handed over screenshots of message threads between Kingsley and Vivian Ashcroft, conversations referencing payments, timing, and a plan to depress the company's value before finalizing an acquisition. She'd kept the images on a personal device rather than a company one, she explained, specifically because she'd suspected, even before any accusations became public, that something about the arrangement didn't sit right with the values the company claimed to hold. It wasn't proof of everything, but it was a thread worth pulling. Sandra used it to file an emergency request for financial records connected to the shell company named in Renee's screenshots. A formal request submitted properly through the court, not gathered through improper means. The judge overseeing preliminary matters approved a limited subpoena, allowing an independent forensic accountant, a former colleague of Amara's from her earliest years in practice, to trace transactions tied to the account. Everything that followed would be built on paperwork obtained the right way. Nothing hidden, nothing that could later be challenged as improperly acquired. 8 days after the accusations first became public, the emergency hearing arrived at the Delaware Court of Chancery, the state's specialized venue for exactly this kind of governance dispute, presided over by Chancellor Miriam Ellison, a woman known throughout the legal community for her exacting attention to documentation and her low tolerance for theatrics. Darius walked in wearing a plain gray suit that still somehow looked out of place among the tailored jackets filling the opposing table, flanked by Sandra Coleman, who carried herself with the calm of someone who'd survived far worse rooms than this one. The gallery behind them was fuller than he'd expected. Dock workers and drivers who had taken the morning off without being asked, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a room that smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy. He didn't turn to look at them, but knowing they were there, settled something no legal strategy could have managed on its own. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he was not the only one whose life would change because of it. Across the aisle sat Elliot Marsh, Leeds attorney for Kingsley, and by extension the interest aligned with Ashcroft Equity, a man whose reputation for precise, merciless cross-examination preceded him into every courtroom he entered. Vivian Ashcroft sat quietly in the gallery behind her legal team, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that made her presence feel more like a formality than genuine concern, as though the outcome were already a foregone conclusion in her mind. Marsh opened by walking the court through what looked, on the surface, like an overwhelming case. He presented the falsified bank statements showing transfers from company accounts into a trust bearing Amara's name, matched them against Darius's signature on unrelated documents, and layered in the adoption records, the old tuition payments, and pointedly, the fact that Amara herself was nowhere to be found. He built his argument around an unspoken assumption that a man who came from the docks could not possibly understand, let alone properly manage, the complex financial instrument now bearing his daughter's name. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes without raising his voice, laying each document on the record with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd already won cases like this before, cases where sympathy for a founder's story rarely survived contact with a stack of bank statements. Several times he let a transfer date hang in the silence after he read it aloud, giving its implication time to settle before he moved on. Sandra pushed back where she could, challenging the authenticity of certain documents and questioning the timeline. But without the original trust paperwork in hand at that moment, her objections landed softer than she needed. Marsh pressed his advantage, and for the first time since the accusations began, Darius felt something close to real fear settle into his chest. Not for himself, but for every driver, every dock worker, every family whose paycheck depended on a company slipping further out of his hands with each passing minute. Chancellor Ellison asked Sandra directly whether the defense had any additional witnesses or evidence to introduce before she considered the board's request. Sandra hesitated, glancing toward the courtroom doors, aware that the one witness who could change everything had not yet arrived and had gone quiet the previous evening. She told the court honestly that she had nothing further to present at this time. Kingsley allowed himself a small, controlled smile, the expression of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. Ashcroft adjusted the cuff of her blazer with the unhurried calm of someone confirming a transaction she considered already complete. Chancellor Ellison lifted her pen to sign the emergency order that would freeze Darius's voting rights and clear the path for a forced sale. Elias, in the front row directly behind his father, stared at the courtroom doors with a tightness in his chest he couldn't shake, torn between the promise he'd made to protect his sister's silence and the growing terror that her plan, whatever it was, had simply run out of time. Darius kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, refusing to let the room see how much he'd already lost, and how much more he stood to lose in the next few seconds. The pen had barely touched the paper when the courtroom doors swung open hard enough to draw every head in the room. Sandra's phone buzzed once in her hand, a message she'd been waiting for without daring to hope it would come in time. Amara stood in the doorway in a dark suit, a worn leather folder held tightly against her side. 18 years of silence and 8 days of sacrifice carried in the steadiness of her expression as she stepped forward into the room that would decide her father's future and her own. The sound of the doors striking the wall still seemed to hang in the air as she crossed the threshold, her footsteps steady against the polished floor despite everything trembling beneath the surface of her composure. Chancellor Ellison lowered her pen without setting it down completely, her eyes moving from the folder in Amara's hand to the attorneys now shifting in their seats. Sandra rose immediately, requesting permission to introduce an emergency witness whose testimony bore directly on the matter before the court. Marsh was on his feet just as fast, objecting on the grounds that the witness in the doorway was the defendant's adoptive daughter and the named beneficiary of the very trust at the center of the dispute. A relationship, he argued, that made her testimony inherently compromised. Sandra countered that Amara was appearing solely as a fact witness with direct knowledge of the trust's origin and purpose, not as legal counsel, and that her personal connection to Darius did not disqualify her from testifying to documented facts. Chancellor Ellison considered the objection a long moment before overruling it, noting that the court would weigh credibility itself once the testimony was heard. Amara took the stand and set the worn leather folder in front of her with a steadiness that didn't fully match the exhaustion behind her eyes. She introduced herself plainly, her name, her 5 years in legal practice, her role as designated protector of the Whitfield Founders Trust, a title she hadn't fully understood the weight of until the past several days forced her to learn it completely. Sandra walked her through the first and most important piece of evidence. Amara opened the folder and produced the original trust document, the one she'd pulled from a digital archive with barely a day to spare. She explained calmly and precisely that the shares placed inside the trust had always belonged to her father personally, set aside years before any outside investment entered the company, long before Ashcroft Equity existed as a stakeholder in Whitfield Harbor and Rail at all. Sandra entered it into evidence alongside the handwritten letter Darius had written the same year, addressed to Amara, describing exactly why he'd created it. Marsh tried to challenge the document's authenticity, suggesting it could have been fabricated recently to match the current crisis. Sandra was ready. She called forward June Alcott, Darius's longtime legal assistant, who confirmed under oath that annual renewal filings for the trust had been submitted every year without exception, filings that existed in the court's own public record system, independent of anything Amara had brought that day. She testified that she'd personally submitted several of them directly to Kingsley's office for review, a detail that visibly unsettled the opposing table. The second piece came from the financial trail obtained through the court-ordered subpoena. A forensic accountant took the stand and walked the court through documentation tracing a payment from a shell company linked to Ashcroft Equity into Preston Kingsley's personal account, a transfer dated the same week he filed the initial complaint against Darius. She described how the shell company had no operational history and existed almost entirely to move that single payment, pulling up routing records and corporate registration filings on a screen positioned for the chancellor, tracing the entity back through 2 layers of ownership until it connected directly to a company controlled by Vivian Ashcroft. The gallery behind Darius shifted audibly, a ripple of quiet murmurs passing through people who had spent 8 days reading his name in headlines that called him a thief. Kingsley's attorney argued the payment was a legitimate consulting arrangement unrelated to the case. The accountant answered that no consulting agreement, invoice, or scope of work had ever been filed to support that claim, and that the timing, days before the fraud complaint was submitted, made the explanation difficult to accept at face value. Kingsley sat rigid, his jaw tightening as the murmurs moved through the room behind him. Sandra turned to the third and final piece, the one Amara had been most reluctant to share, though she understood by now there was no way forward without it. Amara described, without embellishment, how a representative connected to Ashcroft Equity had approached her privately before the hearing, offering her a partnership at a prestigious firm along with a substantial payment, on the sole condition that she remain absent from the proceedings. She explained that she had recorded the conversation legally. Washington, D.C. permits recording with the consent of one party involved, a fact Sandra confirmed for the record before the recording was played. The room fell into a heavy stillness as it played through the courtroom speakers, the intermediary's voice clear enough to leave no room for misinterpretation, stating plainly that Ashcroft Equity did not need Amara to betray her father, only to stay quiet. Vivian Ashcroft's expression didn't change as the recording played, though her hands folded a little more tightly in her lap, and for the first time since the hearing began, she seemed to be calculating rather than simply observing. Amara explained that she'd pretended to consider the offer only long enough to avoid raising suspicion, while she continued gathering the trust documents and financial records now sitting in front of the chancellor. She added, without asking for sympathy, that pursuing this evidence had already cost her the position Schneid spent 5 years building. It was not a performance of sacrifice. It was simply the truth of what the last 8 days had taken from her. Marsh, sensing the momentum shift hard against him, changed his approach and turned toward Amara's credibility. He asked her to recount her early years of homelessness, the fact that she'd never known her birth parents, the tuition Darius had paid. He suggested that a woman who owed her entire adult life to the defendant could hardly be expected to testify against her own interests with any real objectivity. He pressed further. Was it true she'd been found alone outside a bus station with nothing to her name? Was it true the defendant had chosen her specifically because a homeless child made for a compelling story? Had her entire relationship with Darius Whitfield always been, in some sense, transactional? Elias shifted forward, his jaw tight, but Sandra placed a steadying hand on the table, trusting Amara to answer for herself. Amara did not look away from him. A debt is something you pay to be free of it, she said. A promise is something you keep because of who you've decided to become. I am not sitting in this chair to repay a debt to my father. She let that settle. I lost my job, my firm, and the partnership I worked 5 years toward before I ever walked through those doors this morning. I have nothing left to gain from being here except the truth going on the record where it belongs. With all 3 pieces of evidence entered, Sandra asked the court to consider one final provision within the trust document itself, a clause that had sat dormant for 18 years. It stated that if the founder were ever attacked through fabricated financial allegations tied to his family, allegations designed to facilitate a hostile transfer of company control, the voting authority attached to the shares inside the trust would transfer temporarily to the trust's named protector. Amara confirmed for the record that she had been named that protector at the time the trust was created, a designation her father had made before she was even old enough to understand what it meant. Chancellor Ellison took a long moment, cross-referencing the renewal filings against the court's own records, studying the forensic report page by page in silence. The courtroom waited without a sound. Kingsley stared fixedly at the table. Ashcroft watched the chancellor with an expression that had finally lost its earlier composure. Elias gripped the edge of the bench, and Darius sat perfectly still beside Sandra, his hands folded in his lap the way they'd been since the hearing began. Amara remained at the stand, watching the chancellor's face for any sign of what was coming, aware that everything she'd given up now rested entirely on a decision she could no longer influence. She thought, briefly, of the brass key still sitting in a small box on her dresser back in Washington, and of a promise made in a courthouse hallway when she was too young to understand what it would eventually cost either of them to keep. When Chancellor Ellison finally spoke, her voice carried the measured weight of someone who understood exactly how much rested on every word. She stated that, based on the evidence presented, the court found sufficient grounds to issue an emergency order, but not the one the board had brought before her. She ordered the proposed transfer of shares to Ashcroft Equity halted immediately, pending further review. She reinstated Darius's voting rights on a temporary basis while formally recognizing Amara's standing as protector of the trust. She ordered Preston Kingsley suspended from the board, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into the financial evidence presented that day. And she directed that all documentation regarding the suspicious payment and the attempted witness interference be forwarded to the Delaware Attorney General's office for separate criminal review. She was careful to note, for the record, that this was an emergency protective order rather than a final judgment, and that a full hearing on the remaining questions would be scheduled in the coming weeks. It was not the end of the legal process, but it was enough to stop the free fall. Kingsley did not speak as the order was read, his earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by the stillness of a man calculating just how much trouble now stood between him and whatever life he'd imagined for himself. Ashcroft rose without a word once the chancellor dismissed the hearing, her attorneys already speaking in low, urgent tones as they gathered their materials. The sale she'd considered finished only hours earlier, now indefinitely out of reach. Behind Darius, the gallery let out a collective breath that had been held for what felt like the entire morning. Dock workers reached over to grip each other's shoulders. A few wiped their eyes without embarrassment. None of them fully understood every legal term the chancellor had used. But they understood enough that the man who had signed their paychecks for years without ever once treating them as replaceable was still standing at the head of the company that employed them. Outside, in the quiet marble hallway where the noise of the hearing faded into ordinary echoes, Darius found Amara near a window, the leather folder still held loosely at her side. He admitted, in a voice rougher than he intended, that there had been moments over the past 8 days when he genuinely feared she had walked away from the family for good. "You taught me a long time ago," Amara said, "that when someone sets a trap at your front door, sometimes the only way through is to find your way in from behind it." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. "Why let me sit through those days believing you might really be gone? Because if you'd known, you'd have tried to protect me, and any move you made to shield me might have told Kingsley something was being built against him before it was ready. He'd have had time to destroy the very thing that just saved the company." She looked at him. "For 18 years, you've been the one protecting me. This time, I needed it to be the other way around." Elias reached them a moment later and pulled his sister into an embrace that said everything neither of them had the words for. And in that hallway, a silence that carried the full weight of the message she'd sent him days earlier, the one that had asked him to trust her without explanation. He understood now exactly what that trust had cost her, and exactly what it had bought all of them in return. In the weeks that followed, the criminal investigation moved forward steadily, building toward formal charges against Kingsley for fraud and bribery, his personal assets frozen. Investigators later confirmed what Renee Castillo had already suspected, that Kingsley's debts had grown severe enough to make him desperate long before he ever presented a single falsified document. Ashcroft Equity came under separate scrutiny for its role in the attempted witness interference and was ultimately forced to divest its preferred shares under a negotiated settlement it had never wanted to accept. Marsh withdrew from the case within days, quietly informing the court he could no longer ethically represent his client once the extent of the fabricated evidence became clear. Gerald Thornberry, though never charged with any wrongdoing, resigned quietly from the board after an internal review of his conduct made his position untenable, a resignation he offered without argument, as though some part of him had already known his assumptions about Darius had never been fair to begin with. Elias was formally recognized for the irregularities he'd uncovered on his own, taking on an expanded role overseeing internal compliance alongside his technical duties. Amara, having lost her position in Washington, chose not to return to corporate law at all. She opened a small practice of her own instead, and accepted a formal role as special counsel to the very trust that had once been nothing more than a stranger's quiet warning to her father. Darius, once the loan against his personal shares was repaid in full as the company stabilized, stood exactly where he'd always intended to stand, holding on to everything he'd built, without ever abandoning the principles that built it. Months later, on the same dock where he'd once worked double shifts as a young mechanic soaked through from the rain, Darius gathered the people who depended on Whitfield Harbor Rail and told them the story he'd never fully shared, a rainy night 18 years earlier, and a child who asked him only one question. He spoke plainly, the way he always had, telling them that the company they worked for had never really been built on trucks or contracts at all, but on a promise that nobody who worked for it would ever be treated as disposable. Amara stood beside him that day. Before he finished speaking, she reached into her coat and placed something small and familiar into his open palm, the same brass key he'd once given her outside a courthouse when she was still a frightened child with nowhere else to go. The crowd fell quiet, sensing that whatever was passing between father and daughter belonged to them alone, even as it stood witnessed in front of everyone who'd shown up. "You gave me this key on a day when I had no home of my own," she told him. "I'm only giving you back the key to the empire you built with your bare hands." Darius closed his fingers around it, the metal worn smooth from 18 years in her pocket, and slid it into the same canvas jacket that had followed him from the docks to the boardroom and finally into a courtroom that almost took everything from him. The company remained his, $900 million strong. But the truest victory of his life had nothing to do with the number attached to it and everything to do with the woman standing beside him. Once a child left alone in the rain, now strong enough to stand in front of a courtroom and bring her father home. If Darius and Amara's story moved you today, remember what it was really built on. That love, shown consistently in small, ordinary moments, is what ends up saving people when it matters most. If you believe families are worth fighting for the way this one did, subscribe so you never miss the next story, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.